Inclusion and diversity can reduce turnover rate by as much as 40% and increase employee satisfaction scores by 30%. Of course, this has a positive bottom line effect. However, so many diversity and inclusion programs fail. Jason Greer and his family were victims of such a failed program. Today, he will tell us what are the ingredients of a successful inclusion and diversity program. Let's find out. Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Berhus, and today we'll be interviewing Jason Greer. Jason, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Dr. Burris. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Wonderful. And so we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion. So you see, most of the listeners are all over the world, okay? So you would like you to explain, what do you mean by diversity and inclusion, and why is it important in the workplace?
Yeah, no worries. I like the fact that you led with the fact that your listeners are literally all over the world, because we all come from a variety of walks of life. And I don't care if you're in Colombia or in St. Louis, Missouri, where I'm currently from, or where I'm currently at rather, we all sort of have our own way of walking, talking, and acting according to the societal norms that we grew up with, right? And so when I think about diversity as a whole, I think in terms of this overall spectrum that we live in and we reside in. But we also take it a step further, because oftentimes when people talk about diversity and inclusion, they talk about it from this theoretical perspective of what diversity and inclusion should look like. I take things from a brain-based perspective. And when I say a brain-based perspective, is that our brains are consistently telling us a story about the outside world and about each other that 98% of the time is not true. I'm so proud. I wrote this book called Bias, Racism, and the Brain, in which we talked about, we literally took, and when I say we, it's myself as well as my co-author, Phil Dixon. And we literally took my experiences with racism and we charted that from a brain perspective in terms of what I was going through, in terms of what other people were going through, and how, when all is boils down to it, the one thing that we have in common is the fact that we have a brain.
I see. So the common aspect is the brain. What is the diversity aspect?
Is the fact that our brains are coded based on our family, based on our genetic socialization, based on our experiences. So when we talk about the diversity, we're really talking about the diversity of stories. And that even though we have a brain that we all have in common, what makes us unique is that we have this unique perspective that we were born into and that we experience on a daily basis that makes us so different from one another.
Okay, so now define for us the inclusion.
Here's the inclusion piece. It's my belief that I don't care where you come from. I don't care who you are. There's still a place at the table for you, right? It's a matter of, look, Dr. Burris, you and I spoke briefly yesterday, and we have had maybe about 5 minutes conversation before we actually started the podcast. But based on the fact that we have this in common, now we have a point of commonality in which we could start to work together, right? And when we talk about—
You were quite charming on the phone, I must say.
Hey, well, thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you for that. Thank you. But when we talk about, inclusion is really about forming some degree of commonality while also appreciating and embracing the fact that we are diverse at the same time. My story, Dr. Burris, might be different than your story, and your story is different than the next person's story. But that does not take away from the fact that you have so much to bring to the table.
Okay, so tell us, why do a lot of inclusion, diversity and inclusion workshops don't work?
Great question. They don't work because, unfortunately, I go right back to the brain perspective. So many diversity and inclusion workshops, trainings, or even, let's talk about what's going on within corporations across the globe. Diversity and inclusion practices don't work because they focus so much attention on what our differences are, as opposed to really starting to embrace what our commonalities are. And I think it's, and I'll speak to what is currently going on here in America is, after the George Floyd killing, and there was this increased discussion around diversity, there was this increased discussion around racism. there were these organizations and corporations that immediately launched into the idea that they needed to do more for diversity and inclusion internally. That's awesome. The problem is that if you don't get people to buy into that and you don't really cement what the why is behind what we're doing, then it's all theoretical. And if it's theoretical, here's the reality. I don't have time to deal with theoretical anything when I'm dealing with the practical aspects of having to do my job on a daily basis. So I think that so many organizations fail when they look to do diversity workshops, diversity training, whatever the case might be, because they don't really cement the why behind it.
So tell us about the why behind it.
The why is that we are human beings. And the reality is that I don't care if you go to work for Amazon, if you go to work for Google, whatever the case might be, you still got to do your job. But in the process of doing your job, we need to create and foster an environment in which you feel heard, seen, recognized, and appreciated. That's the why behind diversity and inclusion, is the fact that we, again, come from different walks of life. But in the process of coming from different walks of life, we want to work with organizations in which we feel these organizations affirm us. So if we don't get behind the why, and the why being we're human beings and we're doing something that's beneficial to the organization, while also hoping that the organization takes care of us in the process beyond just paying us a salary, that's when diversity works.
So in Europe, there's a lot of diversity on a cultural basis. Like Switzerland has 8 million people. It's right smack surrounded by already 4 different countries. You know, it's Germany, it's Italy, it's France, and Austria. So it's surrounded by different accents, different cultural references. So yes, in some ways, you have to acknowledge the difference so that you're careful not to interpret right away. Or you could be something that you say might be misinterpreted, because in that culture, right, it's not perceived as conducive to a good communication. What do you say about that?
That makes perfect sense. Well, I would agree with that. And I think that, because you're basically talking about bias. And I think that bias in itself has such a negative connotation around it. The reality is that bias is a wonderful thing. Bias keeps us safe. You know, when I was 4 years old, because I saw a flame on the stove and I thought it was pretty. And guess what I did? I went and I touched it and I got burned, right? Well, the bias that was cemented in my brain is don't touch another flame again. And I have not. I think that we really need to go out of our way to identify first that there's nothing wrong with acknowledging someone's differences. Nothing wrong with it at all, because that's what makes us unique. But I think at the same time is in identifying someone's differences, you also make sure that their differences have a seat at the table, a place at the table as well.
I see. So acknowledging the difference, but accepting it as well.
Absolutely. And even accepting the fact, because again, you know, we are human beings and we are bias-driven machines. What I generally tell people is if you have a bias that shows up, and sometimes we have biases that show up in our lives as it relates to other people that we didn't even know were there until we actually had that encounter with that person or those groups of people. The first step is to acknowledge your reaction, forgive yourself for the reaction, and recognize that there is a wonderful learning opportunity here. But it really comes back to this idea that you have to forgive yourself, because oftentimes we don't even know the stories that are playing through our minds.
So any suggestions how to be more aware of the stories in your mind?
The first suggestion I have for people is to be honest, right? It's, you know, speak to America. One of the worst things that you can do to, let's say, somebody white is to accuse them of being racist, because that's taken as such a, you know, that's such a negative hit. And oftentimes the first statement that comes out of so many people's mouths is, but my best friends are Black. Even though you've never seen this person with anybody Black, right? You've been knowing them for 5-10 years, whatever the case might be. I think oftentimes when we are confronted with our own biases, when we are confronted with how we showed up in the moment, the first action that comes up immediately is that we want to get defensive. Well, when you move beyond that defense, now it's time to start being honest. Yes, I did show up in this way, and I need to recognize, or need to at least find some action, some resources, or something to help me to change that perspective that I have. But it really comes back to just be honest.
So how do you work this through in your workshops?
We always take things from a brain perspective. And I'll tell you why we take things from brain perspective. It's I ask this question in my workshops, and the question is, have you ever walked into a room full of people where you were the only, right? And you generally see people raise their hands. Maybe they were the only, Spanish person. Maybe they were the only woman. Maybe they're the only African American, whatever the case might be. And then I ask the question, how did that make you feel? And usually people talk about the fact that they felt lonely, they felt isolated, they felt scared. I'm writing this down in the process as people are sharing this with me. And then I go back and I say, that's an honest feeling. If you felt lonely, you were honest about that. If you felt scared, you were honest about that. If you felt angry, you were honest about that. Now let's take that perspective of honesty and apply it to other areas of your life. And then I start taking people through a series of examples, right? A series of illustrations. And I will actually take them through these case studies and I will say, well, this happened. How do you feel about that? And what I ask them to do is I go, don't give me the thought through answer. Give me your first instinct, your first instinctual answer, the first thing that came to your mind. What is that? Because we create this very non-judgmental zone in which people are able to share in a way that, let's be real, oftentimes people don't feel like they're able to share because they're scared of being labeled as being racist, being sexist, being homophobic. And then coming from that place of honesty, now we begin to identify what are those stories and where do those stories come from in the first place.
So I have an example of that. I went to Harlem for our party and there were all African Americans. I think I was maybe one, myself was white and another person was white. So, and a few, maybe 5 people maximum in a place of 200. So that surprise to say, oh, I'm a minority. That's one. And then 2, sure. Yeah, it's sort of uncomfortable, but we were all enthusiastic for art because it was Kehinde Wiley who did Obama's painting. And
absolutely.
And also there was music
awesome.
And dance, and we were all, the commonality was the appreciation of the arts.
Yes.
So to find that brand, how I see it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you have a commonality or something that you want to do together, how that you can bring it so that you're all together for something.
Yes, exactly. Because you had your why. Your why for being there was your appreciation for this artist, your appreciation for the work, and your appreciation for art in general. I often say
music, dance, it was fabulous.
Music, because it sounds like you had a tremendous time.
Yes.
And do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Did you find that maybe some of the guards that you had when you initially recognized that you were in the minority, did you find that over the course of the evening, those guards sort of tempered down?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Because we were, the appreciation of everyone there, the love for art, for music, yes. The dancing was extraordinary. Yeah.
And let's be real. Fundamentally, even though we all have our unique perspectives and our unique experiences in our lives, we're not that much different. I don't care if you are, again, in St. Louis. I don't care if you're sitting on the beach in Costa Rica. The reality is we generally care for our families. We want to live a good life. We want to be good to other people. And we want other people to be good to us. We want to experience everything that life has to share in this life. Fundamentally, people are not different. We just have all these filters in place because of our experiences that causes us to believe that we are diametrically opposed to somebody who doesn't look like us. But it's in the process of actually having those experiences where you begin to break down those barriers such that you find that oftentimes you have more in common with people than what you initially thought.
Yes, that's true. But it is, I can understand in the beginning, I was a little surprised. I hadn't been in that situation. Like I love jazz, and there's concerts of jazz where whites are in minority that attend it, But
right.
Anyway, let's continue. So how did your personal experience in bias, racism, and the brain, and explain how you came to be specialized in this area?
Yeah, great question. I love your questions. So I was in 1991, so I'm dating myself here. I was 17 years old, and my family, we were the victims of cross burnings by the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. And our family my father was the first Black principal of a grade school in this town called Dubuque, Iowa. And we had no idea that our family was being brought to Dubuque under the constructive integration plan, whereby the city council had agreed that they were going to bring over 100 Black families into the city over the course of 10 years because they really wanted to diversify Dubuque, which had been probably about 98, 99% white. And their hope was by doing this program that they were going to not only diversify, but they were going to increase racial connections across the board. The problem is they never told us that we were coming in as part of this process. And fundamentally, the city council did not go to the people in Dubuque to get their buy-in as to whether or not they were on board with this program. So my father comes in, my mother and I were still in St. Louis at the time because I was my senior year of high school. My parents weren't going to pull me in my senior year in high school. So I still competed for football scholarships at the time. And we just noticed that, after we moved my father there and he would come in on the weekends, we started to notice that things were different with my father. He was carrying this emotional heaviness, this emotional weight. But my father being my father, he did not want to burden us with what he was going through. Here's what he was going through. He was getting all these, myriad of death threats from white supremacist organizations, from people who were saying that, he basically became the face of this forced integration. Well, they found out where my mom and I lived in Bridgeton, Missouri, a small suburb outside of St. Louis that I grew up in. And so we're getting death threats, but we had no context because my father wasn't letting us know as to what was going on in Dubuque. So this all culminated with the Klan burning crosses in protest of our family. So at one point, they erected a cross for my father, they erected a cross for my mother, they erected a cross for me. And that was this public display of, we don't want you in the city. So I'm 17 years old and I don't even know who I'm taking to prom, let alone try to understand how is it that all of a sudden I became the face of something that I don't understand. And more importantly, why is it that these people in the city hate me and they've never met me? Mm. But what I found through, again, coming back to from the perspective of the brain is, Dr. Burrs, I don't care who you are. If you feel like something is being forced upon you to the point where you have no control and your brain goes into a threat state, your body goes into this threat state because you instantly believe that the way of life that I've grown accustomed to is going to be fundamentally shifted and I don't have any control over that shift. Oftentimes what comes out is either people run, or in the case of what we went through, they decided to burn crosses in protest of our family as a public display of the fact that they did not want us from the micro perspective, but they didn't want this program in Dubuque in the first place from a macro perspective. So that really fueled my idea of understanding bias, but it also fueled my understanding of how important it is that if you're going to initiate change, first you need to get the buy-in of the people who are going to be directly impacted by that change.
And so in your workshop, how do you get the buy-in of the participants?
Oh, we share stories. And when I say we share stories, I am upfront 100%. Because oftentimes, especially when we do this in corporate settings, oftentimes the bulk of the people in the environment are white. And they're not only white, but they happen to be people who have gone through a multitude of diversity, forced diversity trainings, forced diversity workshops. And so they're coming in with their own preconceived notions as to what this might be. And I can't tell you the number of times where I've actually had executives, managers, employees tell me, thank God you're so different in terms of how you do diversity, because the last diversity trainer made me feel like I should feel guilty because I'm white. Like I'm the reason why slavery existed, even though my grandfather, my great grandfather never owned slaves. So what I do is I get people to the point where through storytelling, through my own vulnerability, but also encouraging them to be vulnerable at the same time, where I get buy-in is if I can't connect with you at a heart level, it doesn't matter what I put up in my PowerPoints. It doesn't matter what I give you in terms of materials. If I can't cement this at the heart emotional level, this is never going to work. So that's where the storytelling comes in.
I see. And so what advice would you give leaders, executives of how to promote, integration and inclusion and diversity?
Yeah, wonderful question. I keep going back to this term, be honest. Be honest about where you are with this. The worst thing in the world is an executive who stands in front of a group of employees and basically reads off a piece of paper as to why diversity and inclusion matters, because then people feel like it's not authentic. So if you really want to increase inclusion within your organization, or if not the organization, then within your department, be honest about where you are and then be honest about where you want to go. The reality is this: I don't care how hard you try to fight diversity. I don't care how hard you try to fight inclusion. The environment is steadily changing. We're seeing more and more people who look like me, who are earning college degrees, who are earning master's degrees, who are getting their PhDs, and they are entering into the workforce. They are more educated today than they ever have been before. And this is the pool of talent that you have to choose from. So if you're going to really make sure that diversity works for your organization, make sure that you're spending enough time doing the honest work on the personal side such that you are able to embrace diversity, but also making sure that your organization is inclusive in terms of the overall culture. Because you can put out the best recruiting tactics, you can hire from wherever, and you can make people believe that they're coming to work for company ABC, Dr. Burris, and it's going to be the best experience they've ever had. And then they get there, and then 6 months later, they feel as isolated as you could possibly imagine. So it's critically important that leaders be honest about where they are, that they work to create inclusive cultures, inclusive environments. And also, when you get it wrong, just acknowledge that you got it wrong. Fail fast and then move forward.
So let's put it to a particular situation. Like you mentioned, a lot of white men feel very guilty about being prejudiced or other. How do you address that? And what are the consequences, the negative consequences of that guilt?
Yeah, great question. I'll tell you how I addressed this 2 days ago, because I had an executive who readily admitted to me, he goes, I feel guilty for something I'm not sure that I should feel guilty about. And I asked him, what is that? And he goes, I'm made to feel guilty on a daily basis that I don't have more friends of color, that my department is 97% white, that I am not quote unquote woke. He goes, I'm made to feel guilty for this. I feel guilty at times, but then I wonder, is this really my problem? And he goes, and I don't know, pardon my language, Dr. Burris, he goes, I don't know what the hell to do. And I looked at him and I could tell he kept looking down. It's a powerful executive, but he kept looking down because he was scared of my judgment, and I could tell. And I extended my hand and I shook his hand and I just simply said, brother, we are on the right track because you are just honest with me. And I appreciate that. You see, part of the challenge with so many of these D&I initiatives is that they do a very good job of embracing everybody with the exception of the white male and the white female. And more specifically in terms of the white male, because the perception is because you're white, because you're a male, that you have all of this privilege and you're the problem, but we're going to work on the solution with everybody else. What I tell people when we're talking about diversity and inclusion programs is this: you can't have D&I if you're not actually having a seat at the table for all people, including the white male. Look, if you're a white male over 50, you're probably feeling some degree of, where do I fit into this conversation? Because I see employees, and when we talk about diversity, oftentimes we talk in terms of race, class, gender, and those kinds of things, but we don't spend enough time talking about age. If you're a white male 50 years and over, you're looking at your environment, your work environment is probably getting younger. The technology is faster. But at the same time, you're seeing this added emphasis on creating an environment that looks radically different than what the environment looked 20 to 30 years ago when you were a part of it. I don't think there's enough time spent on an emotional level, but as well as an organizational level, on making sure that this particular group of people feels affirmed and feels like they still have a seat at the proverbial table. Does that make sense?
Very interesting. Yes, very, very much. We're coming to the end of our podcast. So tell us, what advice, let's say if there was one particular advice to CEOs of international companies, because that's basically the clients I work with, what would you say to start a better diversity and inclusion? What's the first step? But besides hiring you, of course.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Burris. Thank you. I would say the first start is analyze why you want to do this. Don't just do it. Analyze why you want to do this. Analyze from a metrics perspective, the impact that this is going to have on your business, but also analyze from an internal perspective. why we want to do this. Are we capable of doing this? And then what are the resources that we need to put in place to make sure that these D&I practices benefit our business, but benefit the people who make up our business, which are the employees. But it all comes from the basic statement of start, but start intelligently and start methodically, and then allow it to grow from there.
Excellent. Thank you so very much for sharing your knowledge and your experience. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Boris. I appreciate this.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Boris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.